Mark is a PhD student at the University of Montana, where he studies wildfire and forest regeneration in wilderness areas. He has a master's degree in ecology from Utah State University, where he studied post-fire aspen regeneration. And if I forced him to name another plant that he loves aside from aspen, he also loves ponderosa pine. And I agree, especially their smell and their thick bark and kind of their different strategy from aspen. So we'll hear a lot more about that. And thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here this evening and tell you a little bit about aspen, which I think is a very fascinating and cool tree species. And yeah, both here in Montana and across North America. Just as a little introduction beyond what you said, I'm a PhD student here at the university. I've been here for about 13 months so far. And my current research doesn't involve aspen. These are some of the folks I'm working with. Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe I should.
Yeah.
That's a lot better, probably. These are some of the research team I work with currently, and we work in wilderness areas looking at places that have burned and how the forest is coming back and how climate influences that. So I was in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, just southwest of town for 2 months this summer, and didn't see a single aspen tree my entire time there. So I can't talk about aspen from that experience. So to sort of establish my relationship with aspen, I have to go back a little bit earlier. I wanted to just include a few photos of some of my first interactions with aspen trees. I grew up in Kansas, and which is one of the few states in the US that does not have a natively occurring aspen or quaking aspen. But we made lots of trips to Colorado. And so from a very young age, I really liked aspen as a tree species and got to spend some time in those types of ecosystems. Since then, I've spent a lot of time in aspen forests doing 2 summers of trail crew in Colorado. Photo on the left was a nice campsite in an aspen grove. And I lived in Utah from 2018 to 2020, where there's a lot of aspen, such as in this photo on the right. And my first formal experience with aspen in sort of a research or really research context was during my master's, when I was looking at post-fire conifer regeneration after fire. And we were going to a bunch of sites looking for conifer seedlings, and we didn't find hardly any. We found about, I think, 13 seedlings across this 70,000 acre fire footprint 1 year after fire. So I basically had no data to use from my master's, and so we kind of had to pivot. And luckily, a great pivot turned out to be aspen. There was a bunch of aspen regeneration after fire in that area, both clonally, so asexual suckers that would resprout, as well as a lot of sexual aspen regen from seed. So this was kind of a fluke. I didn't mean to go into aspen, but I sort of ended up there by accident. But it was a great sort of turn of events, and I think it ended up being a much more interesting master's as a result. And I just want to acknowledge my advisor, Larissa Yoakum, and Karen Mock is also Utah State, and she's an aspen geneticist. And so I'll talk a little bit later about some of the kind of interesting gene things about aspen, and that mostly comes from her work. So my experience with aspen has been mostly in post-fire contexts, where at least in Utah, where there's a lot of aspen, it looks like this, with really thick aspen coming back after fire. And I just want to say, so this is my background coming from that post-fire aspen world, which is a very small kind of slice of aspen in general, which is a massive topic. And so I'm sure that I have about two and a half, 3 years of research experience with aspen. But I'm sure many of you maybe have a lot more than that interacting with aspen. So I'm excited to share what I know and what I've learned, and also to learn from you. And if you have any questions or comments, I'm excited to hear them as well. So to just sort of start out, I wanted to place Quaking Aspen in the context of aspen globally. And these are 6 aspen species worldwide. The most widespread one, and this is one of the most widespread tree species in the world, is Populus tremula, or European aspen, in the yellow. You can see that that's a really massive range. So that's that one. In North America, we have 2, Populus tremuloides, which is what I'll be talking about today, and then Populus granidentata. To zoom in on those distributions of North America, these are the 2 species, and their names come a lot from their leaves, or you can infer a lot from their leaf types. So we have Quaking aspen, which comes from the Latin tremuloides to trembling aspen. And then we have big tooth aspen, which I like the name of this, especially from gran, big, and dentata, teeth, big tooth. And so that is the species in more in the Northeast, and of course it has a lot bigger serrations on its leaves. But today I'll be focusing on Quaking aspen, which is the most widely distributed tree species in North America. And just as a really brief top level overview, it's a very fast growing, broadly deciduous tree. It's shade intolerant, so it really loves sunlight, and for that reason, it's often a pioneer species that will come back, especially after disturbances that open up a lot of light on the forest floor. It's clonal. That's probably one of the most famous things about aspen. So because of that, the individual stems that come up don't actually live for that long, only 100 to 120 years on average. But the clone itself can be much older than that, several thousand years or more. And also because of its relatively short lifespan, doesn't grow all that tall compared to a lot of the conifers we have out here. I wanted to highlight all the common names that Quaking aspen is also known by. On the left, many names in English, and of course, a lot of different names in different indigenous languages that all refer to the same species. And I'll draw your attention to lots of these quaking, trembling, quivering, quiver leaf. The Old English term is quick tree, or it comes from the words that mean quick tree. So these names, a lot of them refer to sort of the way that aspen leaves flutter in the wind and move a lot more than a lot of other deciduous broadleaf trees. And just as a quick digression before I get into the meat of the talk, I guess, I wanted to talk a little bit about why aspen leaves might quake. I apologize that this is a smaller screen than I envisioned, so if you can't read that, that's fine. So you can answer this question in 2 ways. The first is, what is the actual mechanism that makes the leaf quake? And then the more interesting question is why might the leaves flutter, or what's the purpose of that? And so the answer to the first question is that aspen have a very long petiole or stem that is flattened and attached perpendicular into the leaf. And so it's strong in this axis, but not in this axis right here. And so it ends up, that causes the leaf to quake and quiver a lot, hence its name. However, we're not quite sure why this has evolved or what function it serves. There are lots of I guess theories about this. One is that it might help to minimize too much light reaching the leaf, to keep it within a suitable amount of light by constantly shifting the leaf into shade and back into sunlight. Along a same line, people have also proposed potentially it's to minimize the risk of overheating, to ensure a constant airflow across the leaf, so that the photosynthesis doesn't, or it can maintain sort of the optimal temperature conditions. Along the same lines, people have also proposed potentially it ensures a fresh supply of carbon dioxide is constantly reaching the leaf and sort of flowing across the leaf. It could be due to yeah, it's more flexible and less prone to wind damage. And also to let light sort of filter down into the lower canopy. Yeah.
The roots of the range and product species have a black video as well, so like
Yeah, I think all aspen and the European aspen also is Populus tremula, so also from the Latin to tremble. So I think all aspen share this long stem and kind of quivering. So yeah, this isn't necessarily just unique to quaking aspen. One kind of interesting study, I think from the 70s, they stabilized some leaves with little like splint, so it didn't quake, and other ones that they left regular fluttering, and they found that the stabilized leaves had more pest damage. Insects would land on there more often, so it could be that it's kind of like a horse like skin, or like it quakes to get rid of pests. But it's also possible that all these are partially true and partially false, and there's no function. But I think it's one of the first kind of mysteries of aspen, kind of a curious thing that we're not quite sure why it evolved this way. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about three major things. The first is why we might care about aspen, or why does aspen matter as a species. The second is some more of its life history and things from regeneration into its kind of strategies of growth and defense. And then I'm going to touch briefly at the end on aspen decline, because there's a growing concern, I guess, across especially the Western US, that aspen numbers are going down, more mortality. So I'll talk a little bit about what things might be causing that, and what the future sort of looks like for aspen. And this range, makes aspen look, absolutely massive and like it's everywhere. But of course, this is just sort of the extent that it can occur, and the actual occurrence of aspen is not so kind of uniform. So this is a map of the lower 48 with aspen prevalence. So we can see that there are some kind of pockets. The lake states have a lot of aspen. The states of Colorado, where I spent a lot of time growing up, and in Utah, where I lived during my master's, is kind of a big aspen bubble. Has the highest, kind of most pure and contiguous stands of aspen, and where it occurs sort of, isolated from conifers at times. And then also, of course, I want to highlight the state of Montana with Missoula, the red dot there. And so we can see that we have a lot less aspen than places like Colorado and Utah. But there are pockets, on the west side of the Bob and up further north from us, are more aspen. I mentioned that I had worked in the Silway Bitterroot wilderness, just southwest of Missoula, and this map says that there are little pockets of aspen, but like I said, I didn't actually see any. I was keeping my eye out as I hiked around. So I think here, yeah. I guess, yeah. So as you can see from that map too, aspen can sort of occur in very homogeneous groupings, as on the left, or in more isolated pockets amidst conifer trees, at least out here in the west. And then the right is much more of what it probably what it is in Montana for the most part. And I'll just, I guess, going back one thing, I'll draw your attention that we have aspen all the way from Mexico in isolated pockets and at high altitude, all the way up to Alaska, and across the entire continent, I guess. So it's able to live and grow in a lot of different locations. So I'm going to talk a few things about why I find aspen interesting and why I think it is of special importance as a tree species. The first is that in the Western US, it's one of the only, often the only broadleaf tree that occurs in any amount of number, maybe outside of riparian areas with cottonwood and things. But in more montane forests, aspen is really the only broadleaf tree that we have. And for this reason, it fulfills a lot of good services to animals for habitat and stuff. This is a figure or a graph where they went in and measured the amount of bird species in pure aspen stands, and then ponderosa pine stands were right next to this. I think that this was in the Southwest. And they found that the 1-to-1 line would be the red line in the middle. That would be if they had the same number of species in each stand. But they found that in aspen stands, there were often a lot more bird species, both number of birds and richness of bird species. So there's lots of birds that use aspen as cavity dwelling. It's easy to bore into as kind of a softer wood. Animal or birds like the ruffed grouse, aspen is a really important habitat for them, especially in the winter. And I also want to highlight all the mammal species that make use of aspen a lot. Aspen forests can have a lot more forage underneath them than equivalent conifer forests, I think in large part because they let more light filter through and less dark understories. And so animals like beaver eat aspen leaves and buds. Of course, elk, deer, and moose love aspen, and oftentimes post-fire areas with lots of aspen will be really good places if you like to hunt, because there's a lot of wildlife. Porcupines eat the bark during the winter, as well as in the middle. I wanted to show kind of a fun video here of this is a black bear that has climbed up into an aspen tree and is breaking off a branch to get at the catkins, which are the reproductive parts of the aspen tree, shown on the right here, which are really high in nutrients and stuff. So just a sampling of many animals that like aspen, that eat aspen and live in aspen forest. Another cool thing, and this is partly I think why the animals like deer and elk and stuff like to eat aspen, especially in the winter, is that the bark can photosynthesize. I mean, I think in plants in general, at any place that light can reach, I think there's generally a chlorophyll and it's making energy. But because of aspen's really thin bark, it can use that to create energy from the sun. You can see the green layer in the bark that the peel cut away. This is kind of a cool old study from the 70s, and they measured the amount of energy or amount of carbon dioxide that the tree ingested through its bark. And while it's a lot lower than the rate compared to leaves, only about like a quarter compared to the leaf photosynthesis. Importantly, it keeps creating energy during the winter, after the leaves have fallen. In these months, from October through May, it's still giving the tree a boost of resources. And so, yeah, it's an important source of energy in the winter. Another interesting study showed that in May, right when leaves were budding out and very small, there was actually more chlorophyll per unit area in the bark than there was in the leaves. And then that by August that had flipped. So now the leaves had a lot more chlorophyll than the bark did. And so the tree is clearly sort of shifting its resources to take advantage of when it doesn't have leaves, it shifts its resources, I think, into the bark and then back into the leaves because they are more efficient. So yeah, this is one reason why elk and deer like the bark. It's high in sugar content and things because there's photosynthesis going on, especially during the winter. However, the downside of this, because it has thin bark that can photosynthesize, this means that it's at risk for things like fire. Its strategy is not to resist fire like a ponderosa pine would be. So it doesn't take much disturbance to kill it, to girdle the stem. Things like herbivory are also much bigger problems, and pathogens. I mean, it's just a thinner skin, and so any wound to the bark is a lot more grave than it would be for a conifer, like Doug fir or something like that. So here are some photos of elk browsing on the bark, and then a bear claw mark as it's been climbing up into the tree. And I think we probably, if you've been in aspen forest, I'm sure you've seen the human carved marks on aspen trees. And so yeah, I mean, these are like wounds, and so a small wound, of course, it can heal over, but the higher either eating up the bark or carving obviously isn't good for the tree. So these are some of the downsides of their kind of the trade-off in the bark. But on this note of human interaction with aspen tree and human carving, I want to touch briefly on the idea of arbor glyphs, which like petroglyphs are markings left on trees though. And there's some interesting, I think in general, I definitely don't promote carving on aspen trees at all, but there are some pretty interesting research and cultural studies that have used historic carvings on aspen trees to infer things about the people that live there. So one really interesting example is some researchers that traced the history of sheep herders from the Basque country in the Western US, and used markings. Here's one from 1879 from an aspen tree. And by like tracing a bunch of aspen trees, they could tell people moving around in different people groups, but by their sort of tags on these trees. And so I think it is kind of an interesting, it's one of the only tree species out here that you could mark on and it would last. You can't do this on a ponderosa pine. So it is somewhat of a canvas for us humans to write our names and create art. Of course, animals other than us aren't the only ones who use aspen. Aspen as a tree species is not the greatest for lumber. It's very low density and not very strong. And it's also not rot resistant, so it needs to be treated if you want it to last for any amount of time. However, it is splinter free and non-resinous, which means that it is good for some things. So it's used a lot in chopsticks, in addition to a bamboo, things like matchsticks, and like softwood materials. And you can use it for paneling and things like that, but it's definitely not as much of a commercial tree compared to many other species that we have. There are also some medicinal and I guess edible uses. I've read that the indigenous peoples have used the bark, which contains a salicin, which is similar to aspirin, as a way to treat fevers and things like that. The bark also contains vitamin C, and it can be sweet at certain times of the year, and kind of a treat. So there are a few uses of the tree in that regard too. However, I think probably from a human standpoint, the biggest sort of ecosystem service that aspen provides is tourism and sort of enjoyment. Again, out here in the Western US, I guess this is less true in Montana with larch, but it's one of the few species that turn color in the fall. And so in places like Colorado, it creates a huge hubbub in the fall because everyone wants to go to the best aspen groves and see the color. Yeah.
How important is that foliage? Just like the fact that the leaves are falling and creating that layer of the...
Yeah, aspen stands have a lot higher nutrient cycling than the conifer forest in general. Just like you say, because the leaves are falling to the forest floor and decomposing. So there's a much bigger kind of cycle of the nutrients that flow through aspen, at least in the West, yeah. Since if you're comparing aspen to conifer.
Is Aspen one of those trees that would ever like fade and sometimes try to go under?
No, not that I know of. Yeah. And then I just wanted to highlight, I think the last sort of less tangible benefit of aspen trees. I think they're a tree considered very, very beautiful by many people. So I wanted to highlight two of my favorite Ansel Adams photographs of aspen trees. Yeah, and I think especially, I keep going back to especially in the Western US, this contrast between aspen and conifer. I think it just kind of highlights the form. Aspen's very different than other species we have here, so it kind of draws people's attention because of that. The last sort of function of aspen or service that aspen might provide, or thing that we might say aspen is important because is this idea that aspen forests may be effective fuel breaks in the event of fire, because they have a lot higher moisture content in their leaves than conifers. This is a photo that I took in Utah of a high severity fire that swept through, leaving only this aspen stand in the middle, sort of. And folks have done research to test this question, because it's generally sort of anecdotal. And there have been some people, some studies that have shown, in this case, they started a fire in spruce and jack pine forests in Canada, and it went, really well until it hit this aspen portion of the block, and then it stopped. And so we do see this pattern at in places and in times. However, it's certainly not I guess universal thing, and especially with climate change, as climate is getting hotter and drier, I think climate is much more of the driving force behind when a fire occurs and how it spreads. And so it kind of overrides these bottom-up controls that aspen might provide. However, there's some folks in my old lab at Utah State University who are doing research currently to determine at like broad scales how effective aspen forests are at slowing down fire, stopping fire.
But they're not fire resistant.
No, and that's a good point. Fire benefits aspen generally. So it wouldn't make sense if aspen, if their strategy, if you will, what was to prevent fire, because fire is a very important part of their life cycle. But there are many kind of anecdotal observations of fires slowing down or stopping when they hit aspen. So I want to move in now to more of aspen's life history. And I'm going to start at the smallest scale, that they have 19 chromosomes, and they're dioecious, meaning that an individual tree or clone will be either male or female, unlike lots of trees. However, aspen are not very dimorphic, so they look very, very similar between male and female trees. The only difference is a little portion on the 19th chromosome. Is a little region of the genes that code in females for bud formation, and in males don't. It's not expressed. But other than that, the trees are I think it's hard to tell outside of spring when they're actually making pollen and seed. One interesting pattern, there's kind of potentially a structure to the sex in aspen. This is a paper from the 70s. I go back to these old papers, but there are a lot of really cool kind of research being done back in the day. And this paper in Colorado found that at higher elevations, there were less female clones, less female trees, and more male. And they're not quite sure why this might be. It could be that the energy investment in female trees of creating a bunch of seed made it less conducive to be in like the less hospitable sort of marginal habitat at higher elevations. However, they did find that female trees grew a little bit faster than males at all I guess elevations. So this is, I guess, another sort of unanswered question, but it's a kind of curiosity of aspen. So they have 19 chromosomes. Most aspen trees are diploid, meaning they have two copies of each of those chromosomes, like us. However, we can also have triploid aspen. So they have three copies. And these arrows are pointing to the first chromosome, which is the biggest chromosome in aspen. So you can see three copies in the triploid. And this has some big effects on how the aspen look. Diploid aspen. So we see the photo on the bottom here. There are two aspen stands directly across from each other on a road. And the ones on the left, which are diploid, have much smaller leaves. The triploid aspen have much bigger leaves. And this is kind of a pattern that holds for diploid and triploid aspen, where triploids grow faster and taller in general. They're much more resource intensive. And because of this, they're a much higher risk for embolism. So for like a bubble forming in their water column as they bring water up from the soil, because they're kind of cavalier. I mean, they're growing so fast that it's like they can grow too fast and then I guess transpire too much water, and they're at risk in drought conditions for that reason. Because they're also at higher risk for pathogens, because they tend to invest more resources into growth than defense. And finally, they're also considered to be sterile or otherwise are kind of reduced fertility, I guess. Yeah, so that's an interesting thing that, yeah, they can't reproduce sexually, but they can clonally still. And much like with sex and aspen, there is actually a kind of interesting spatial pattern to triploid and diploid. Across Canada and the Northeast, there's much less triploid aspen. Whereas in the Western US, where we are, there's a much higher percentage of triploid aspen populations. And the thinking behind this is that the blue line here is the last glacial maximum, so where the glaciers went to before receding. So we think that the aspen in the Western US are kind of a subpopulation. They're slightly distinct from the aspen across Canada for this reason. Potentially there's something about them that makes there be more triploid in the Western US. And it's also possible that it's harder to survive out in the Western US. And so these triploid aspen that are faster growing, if the climate is good and not too hot and dry, it would be I guess an advantage to be triploid. One interesting, very recent application of diploid and triploid. This is a paper from just in January of this year. They were trying to to use satellites to detect triploid versus diploid aspen. So they combined some really high resolution satellite imagery here, showing infrared imagery, and then measured a bunch of aspen leaves on the ground. And they could link these two things together to make a model to predict where aspen would be triploid or diploid, just from using satellite imagery. And so this is what the distribution looks like across like a landscape, at least in their study site. So in this case, almost all the aspen were triploid, so they were faster growing, but sterile, and then only little portions of diploid aspen. And importantly, they could use this to sort of scale across the landscape and look at things that were different between the two. And they found that the triploids, again, had higher leaf nitrogen and higher canopy water content, which you think would be a good thing, to have more water. But this is because they were kind of, going past their overstepping their resource quota, I guess, and kind of pulling up too much water. Which is why the authors of this study point out that triploid aspen are at higher risk in a future hot and dry climate, because they can't regulate their stomata and close them when needed. And so on this landscape would not be maybe the best in 20, 30 years if this place will get hotter and drier. But this sort of map can be useful for managers and things to sort of plan and map out different strategies they might want to use to help aspen going forward, or to predict the future. So I talked about chromosomes and sort of the small scale things, but so now I'm going to move into actual how aspen regenerates and comes up. And of course, the most famous way for aspen is clonally or asexually through a aspen sucker, as they're called. So where something buds up from a existing root system. And these have there's a lot of benefits to this strategy. The first is that you can share resources between trees or stems. If part of the clone is over there where there's a bunch, like next to a stream, it can transport water, 100 meters over here to a tree that needs it. It's also very, very prolific after disturbance because it already sort of has boots on the ground. There's already resources. They're ready to go. And it also means that if you're sterile, if you're a tremuloid aspen, it doesn't really matter if you can clonally reproduce. However, of course, there are cons that come along with that. The first being that you can't, or that aspen cannot adapt to changing environmental conditions like climate change. And also there's very, very limited migration because you have to, as a sucker, you have to come up from an existing root system. So you can't move very far in any successive generation. So this means that if aspen can only use clonal methods of reproduction, it can't move across the landscape fast. For instance, to move with if climate's changing, to track that. One really, really good example of an aspen clone, or this method, is Pando, the aspen clone in southern Utah, which you may have heard of. This is the world's biggest organism, biggest aspen clone. The name Pando comes from the Latin "I spread," so sort of this idea that it keeps getting bigger. Yeah, this is the world's largest organism of any species that we've found, at least so far. It's estimated to be about 6 million kilograms, and it's comprised of almost 50,000 stems or trees. I mean, what would appear to be a tree, but they're just stems coming up from the same organism.
Any idea how old it is?
It's a great question. Yeah. So historically, folks assumed, there have been ballpark numbers thrown out, like 80,000 years, 100,000 years. Is it 1 million years old? Because it is hard to date. You can core a tree, but of course you only get the age that stem has been growing, which, like I said at the beginning, is probably 120 years at most, maybe 200 years if you're lucky. But there is kind of a bound on it. This place was glaciated probably about 14,000 years ago, and so that sort of establishes the upper limit. But it's probably somewhere in the realm of 3 to 10, 12,000 years old.
Is it a diploid or
I think I don't actually know for sure. I do know, and I forget if I guess I said this later that a fertility in aspen does decline through age, and so I think my understanding is that even if this was diploid, it's probably old enough that it's not really producing much seed that is fertile at this point. So if effectively it would be sterile potentially because of that. But I don't know about the diploid triploid. That's a good question. So the other way that aspen can reproduce is through seed sexually. So aspen make catkins in the spring, and then these are wind pollinated from the male trees, and then the female trees release seed. That's very fluffy and cotton-like and light, and then this seed is wind dispersed onto the ground. A single tree can make well over a million seeds in a given year. So very, very prolific seeders, but they're very small seeds. So kind of the trade-off between lots of seeds that don't have much energy stored in each individual one. They've been shown to wind disperse over 10 miles. Yeah, people have found seedlings growing with no aspen seed source, within 10 miles. It's unclear exactly what controls seed crops or why a given tree seeds in 1 year, not the next. The period is about every 3 to 4 years. And there's been suggestions that it might be stress related. So if a tree senses that it isn't doing so well, it might invest its energy into releasing seed. It could also be smoke triggered. I think I will touch on that again in the next slide, I think. And then, yeah, again, the fertility of these seeds declines with the age of the clone. So this is an example, some photos of a very, very heavy aspen seed crop. And this was the area that I was studying in my master's post-fire. So this tree on the left, it just looks like someone stuck like a bunch of cotton balls on the tree. And this happened 1 year after a big fire, and all the trees in the area were kind of coordinated with their seeding, which is one of the reasons why we think it might be smoke related potentially. And it makes sense because these seeds are really highly tied to burned soil to germinate. So it would make sense if that was at least a cue in some regard. But it kind of looked like winter with like a snow on the ground. So this is what an aspen seedling looks like, just 1 year old. And the pros of this method are kind of the reverse of the cons of asexual regeneration. And of course, with sexual recombination, you get a big increase in diversity in the population. But with that, 10 plus mile dispersal distance, you can travel very, very far distances in each generation with which to track climate change and stuff like that. However, it grows much slower than suckers because it starts out from a tiny seed, so it doesn't have that boost of the kind of communal energy resources, and it has very specific moisture requirements to germinate. It needs water to germinate, which can be an issue in some places that seed fall. So these two methods can occur in the same place, overlapping. This is a photo. In the white box are aspen seedlings from seed, and then right above them is an aspen sucker. These are about the same age, but the sucker is much taller already, growing right next to each other. And so you might wonder, is there a way to tell these apart? And some of my work in my master's was to develop some methods that we could say this is a sucker, this is a seedling origin aspen, so that we could tag them differently and ask our questions we wanted to ask. And the big things are that the seedling origin aspen has two cotyledons that come up initially, and then these are opposite, so they come out at the same point on the stem. And then the first true leaves as well are opposite. And then every other leaf on the seedling and as well as suckers are alternate. So this allows us, even in the second growing season or third growing season, they still have little bud scars that are opposite. There's just two little tiny scars that tell us that this came from a seed. And then of course, yeah.
Sorry, I was wondering, could a seedling aspen grow through the system with a huge clone aspen if it's stressed?
That's a great question. We're not completely sure. We think that, I think there's some research that we want to do in the next couple of years to see if a seedling can sort of tie into a clone. And I think my hunch would be that yes, that happens. But I don't. Yeah. To be determined. That's a good question though. And then within several years, it's kind of, you can't really tell at all. They look exactly the same. Unless you took like leaf samples and determined, is this like, are these all the same for these different stems? And you could, with really intensive sampling, you could determine it. But from a purely visual standpoint, after the first 2 or 3 years, it's basically impossible. Some other things that we use to tell them apart are that seedlings at the same height, a seedling will be usually a lot thinner than a sucker, again, because it grows slower. And then seedlings also often occur in structures like next to logs or in little holes and depressions, probably because this is where the seed sort of just accumulates as it flows across the landscape. These structures trap seed. So we also use these sort of things to determine if it was more likely to be a seedling or a sucker. Yes. And yeah, so these also would be shading structures and moisture structures. Some research we did with two growing seasons of growth mortality, it didn't appear that survival was higher in these things compared to like an open aspen seedling. It could be just because it started out with a lot more, so the competition is a lot higher. Because all 60 of these seedlings definitely can't survive going forward. But yeah, they probably also do contribute for moisture. And then I just want to point out that young aspen seedlings really don't look much like we, or like I assumed initially of what the sort of prototypical aspen leaf, that the heart-shaped leaf. These young seedlings have much more narrow lanceolate leaves, which then become sort of more regular after a year or two. So my first time in a post-fire area with a bunch of aspen seedlings, I had no idea I was looking at aspen until I was told by someone else, because they didn't look anything like the kind of older plants and suckers. So this is perhaps obvious, but I think it's important to reiterate that every aspen plant on the globe, of course, started initially from seed, seed into a seedling, and then that seedling became the parent for the suckers that came up, or the ramette, in kind of clone language. However, for the last, during the middle 20th century, this first sort of step from seed to seedling was considered very, very rare in the Western US. And people thought that for the most part, it was just suckering that was kind of sustaining aspen. And then this was because it was considered too hot and dry in the Western US to support young seedlings, kind of those fragile seedlings, and the germination from seed. And so because of this sort of stereotype or this assumption, there's some kind of fun quotes from the old literature, such as aspen is unable to reproduce by seed in the Front Range of Colorado, 1961. Or no fact of aspen ecology in Utah, at least, seems more certain than that aspen trees reproduce only through vegetative means. So in this context of assumed rarity, it was enough. And I guess to just tie that up, the thinking was that seedlings weren't occurring. They hadn't been occurring at least for 10,000 years, back to when it had been cooler and wetter in the Western US. But the thinking was that all these aspen trees we see, it must be incredibly old, because they've just been resprouting continuously. So in this context, it was enough to publish a paper when this person found a single aspen seedling in Utah, and he published this paper saying, "I found an aspen seedling." And even after the 1988 fires in Yellowstone, there was a lot of aspen seedlings found after those fires, but still it was sort of portrayed in this, like, this is a very rare event, and it's probably only because of these favorable weather conditions that it was wet and cool enough for these seedlings to germinate. However, since those 1988 fires, there's been a lot more examples of aspen seedling establishment, mostly after fire, but after some other things like on a mine site. And so some of my work in my master's was to try to quantify how common is aspen sexual establishment, because for most of the 20th century, it had been, at least in circles of forestry and stuff, people had just assumed that it didn't really happen, or it didn't really matter in the Western US. And so first I collected, these are all the historical documented occurrences in the literature. So this is just things that people published. So it doesn't include, people just out for a hike or a walk. But still much less prevalent than sucker regeneration, but occurring in most states in the Western US. However, to get like a better handle on actually how common it was, in 2020, I led a research crew that we set this search area in the Intermountain West across Arizona, Utah, Wyoming, and Idaho. And we went to every fire that had burned in 2018 and surveyed the fire for aspen seedlings. And so we went into these fires and had a bunch of plots and recorded if we saw seedlings or not. This is a photo of a bunch of aspen seedlings in a burned area. And we found seedlings in 80% of fires. They were pretty, I mean, only 12% of plots. So most plots didn't have aspen seedlings. However, most fires did. So in one fire, there might be a single plot that we found an aspen seedling. But this 12% of plots was higher than any other conifer species, except for lodgepole pine. So compared to other, ponderosa pine and other tree species, aspen seedlings were kind of equivalent. And importantly, that they only occurred on burned soil. So that's a really important kind of, the seeds need bare mineral soil to establish. They can't go through thick layers of litter and duff. And here are some photos. Sometimes we have found a single aspen seedling kind of solitary by itself. Other times found them in very large numbers, which probably is linked to seed availability. But which I mentioned earlier is an area of aspen ecology that not much is known about. And we also were interested in what sort of things predict where you find aspen seedlings. And so aspen suckers in the gray line right here sort of occurred at the same frequency across climate, or across like the average climate of that site. So from really dry areas to wetter areas, it was about a 50% chance of finding aspen suckers in that plot, whereas seedlings were much more likely in the wet areas, and also much more likely in places with low aspen suckers. So this shows us that the historical narrative was somewhat true, that aspen seedlings are really tightly linked to moisture requirements, and they can occur just everywhere. But it also showed that they're not rare necessarily, and that they're probably outcompeted by suckers when they co-occur. So aspen suckers, which grow much faster, probably can have the kind of the edge on seedling origin aspen. So to get back to the question of what accounts for the fact that aspen is such a widespread tree species, I think there's several reasons. One is its ability to grow in many different climates and a wide range of climate in a given location. I think Montana is a great example of the extremes that species here you must endure. Eventually, very, very cold, all the way up to over 800 degrees. Aspen grows at sea level in Maine and Washington State, all the way up to almost 12,000 feet in Colorado. So it's a very kind of a generalist species, and it can grow on many types of soils, though it especially is prevalent on sandy and gravelly soils. I think a big reason though is because of these two different types of methods of regeneration. So this gives it different strategies that can exploit different conditions. It has the long dispersal distances of seeds. But then once it's established, it's very tenacious and hard to kill, with that ability to sucker and resprout from a clone. It's also disturbance loving. Likes to come into disturbed sites, which is a good, I guess, quality in the species to be widespread. As things like fire and mudslides and wind disturbances are constantly shaping landscapes. I think this bark photosynthesis probably isn't a large reason necessarily, but I think it does give the aspen a competitive edge over conifer species, or a more thick barked species that sort of have to stop photosynthesis during the winter, or during times when I just want to highlight sort of this example, I guess, of strength through weakness. I think aspen is oftentimes thought of as kind of a weak species. It's really susceptible to pathogens and insect attack. It doesn't take much to kill an individual stem. However, this trade-off, I mean, aspen has chosen, or through evolution has selected for traits that invest more in reproduction and regeneration, I guess, rather than defense. I think this is one reason why that accounts for aspen's widespread range across North America and other aspen species across the world. Yeah, so the aspen trees died, but the next flush is in full force here.
And all those things are clones of the ones
Yeah.
that died.
Yeah, we can't say like how many clones there are. It could be this is one clone. It could be many clones. To tell that, you'd have to go in and actually like test leaves for genetics and stuff, and to establish the boundaries of clones. I should have mentioned though that there are some ways to tell clones apart. The best is the timing of leaf out in the spring. A clone, like a single clone, will often have very synchronized leaf budding, but like when the leaves come out, it's a little bit less reliable in the fall when the leaves change color. They can be used to tell clones apart. However, the things that control leaf color change are also tied to more microclimate, temperature and soil and things like that can vary across a clone. So the spring leaf bud out is the best visual way to differentiate clones.
Whoever.
Yeah.
Do people guess like, oh, I bet there's 3 clones in here. Or they don't.
I think yeah, people try, and also from like leaf shape and other sort of characteristics that the tree might have, or leaf color and other things, or size. But it's notoriously hard, and even within a big clone, there can be little pockets of different clones that have come in and are established. And so the only way to really systematically know is to test. I take a bunch of samples, but that's very expensive and time consuming. Yeah.
Clones last for 100 in the system. Could there be one tree that is much larger than the other?
Well, you mean a different clone that is much older, or?
Yeah, one tree that doesn't die after 200 years. That is much more.
Yeah, I think that the oldest that they've ever seen, like a single stem being, I think is like 250 years old or so. I think that the bark or the wood is just very prone to rotting and things that it doesn't survive as, I mean, like a conifer, like 600, like 1,000 years. And I mean, yeah, I guess in terms of like mother tree, since they're I guess already connected, there is that sharing of resources, even if all the stems are very young, and it's still like the root network is effectively the sort of mother tree as that thing. Peter, did you have a question?
Yeah, so do you think that the majority of stands have posted more than one clone?
I think there. I mean, I think there's a good chance of that. I mean, if there's one seed that falls originally, and it's very well suited to that environment, and it could be like the best thing for that microclimate, and might. But I imagine that if one seed fell there, then probably there was at least initially other clones that started.
So it sort of makes, because when I go into, previously when I go into the stand of Aspen, I would think, oh, this is cool. But the information you're providing makes me think that probably most of them will burn once or twice in the past 500 years.
Yeah, and I think that's the sort of a slight change in our or like I think we're starting to realize like, okay, that there probably has been seed-based regeneration happening all along. Maybe like it's much lower level than sucker and clonal aspen. So I mean, after a fire, probably almost all of this is clonal, but there probably all along has been little pockets of seed-based regeneration. Of course, it only takes one seed to come down and persist, and then it turns into a clone. So it only takes one a successful like extermination in like the first 5 years until it's big enough to be more self-sustaining.
I'm surprised that no one has looked at that, has gone in and taken 100 leaves from 100 different stems to see how many clones or how many genotypes there are.
Yeah, the person who had the maps with the triploid diploid, short like that person I worked with at a Utah State, and she was big on aspen genetics, and she did go into some big stands that had been thought to be one clone, and I think her findings were that for the most part that was true. Like most of that stand was the same clone, but then there were little like small pockets of other ones, and so it was a lot more I guess diverse than what one would assume. Although I think still that the dominant clone, there's a reason that it's probably persisted for so long, and it's probably, I think it's the little clones are sort of pushed in and kind of, it's hard for them to grow big, but there are little pockets, I think, often. So just to end this, I'm going to talk briefly about some of the, I guess, future pathways of aspen. This is a map showing in purple some of the areas that has been identified or mapped as places of aspen decline. So locations where the amount of aspen on the landscape is decreasing. So there's a few up in Montana, just northeast of us, but for the most part, the big portions are like the focus is more in Colorado and up in Canada and places. There's also a phrase which you may have heard, which is sudden aspen decline, which is a phrase that people have given to more kind of brief and sudden sudden events where all of a sudden a bunch of aspen die. And so it's there's multiple causes. It's for this, which I'll touch on a little bit. I think for sudden aspen decline in particular, it's generally related to drought conditions. I think it's a thing where a lot of, like, it's a very hot, dry year, and a lot of aspen get embolisms or drought stress, and then several years later they all of a sudden die, which can kind of mask the, I guess, the cause, since it's a little, a little bit delayed. I think the trees still are like they have all the other root systems that are still kind of keeping them alive. But I think in this case, it's generally related to drought, although it's still unclear completely what is driving some of this. This is a kind of synthesis of across the entire continent of what is causing or aspen trends, I guess. So this paper showed that across North America, there's been an increase in mortality rates of aspen over the last 30, 40 years, and as well as a decrease in basal area or the amount of aspen on the landscape. And so this paper tried to look at what are the reasons driving this, and they identified hotter, drier climate change essentially, and competition and herbivory pathogens as leading to increases in mortality. These three also identified as causing decreases in growth and decreases in recruitment. However, the interesting one is that the disturbance is shown to be driving increases in recruitment. So sort of going against this trend
Oh, increases.
in recruitment. So yeah, how much aspen was coming was regenerating. And so I'm going to talk about, but I guess each of these individually. The first is climate change and changing climate. This is a map showing climate suitability of aspen relative to 1960s through the 90s. So green locations are places where that used to be unsuitable climate for aspen, but now are expected to be suitable in the future. And blue are locations that were suitable, but now are not suitable, or in 2056. And so this is a big change. And even with wind dispersed seeds that can travel 10 miles in a generation, probably is too far to completely track that. So this is one reason we might be concerned about aspen. And of course, this is not only for aspen, this is true of many species. Pathogens also are much more prevalent under hotter, drier climates. The tree is more stressed potentially, and so it doesn't have as many resources to devote to defense. Also, hotter or less cold winters can let insects overwinter. So this is also related to climate change. Ungulate herbivory is also a big issue in many places. In this photo, it might be a little hard to see, but on the left side is a fenced out exclosure. So there's a lot of young aspen on the floor, whereas on the right, there's no young aspen. They've all been eaten by probably elk in this case. And sort of the classic trophic cascade model, I don't know if you've seen in textbooks from Yellowstone, where they had these aspen forests, which in the absence of any elk or deer do just fine, but then with only elk, they get just hammered, and it's very, very, very reduced growth. But then when they reintroduce wolves, the wolves controlled the elk, and the elk, then there were less elk to eat the aspen. And so it kind of restored the aspen numbers. So this is a complex issue related to predators across the Western US and like overgrazing and stuff. But it's a big issue with aspen in some places where they just can't, young aspen can't get established because they get eaten and browsed before they can get above browse height. And then finally, I think one big reason for the aspen decline is this lack of disturbance and fire suppression. This is aspen suckers after fire, just 2 years after fire, and they're already 7, 8, 9 feet tall. So disturbance is a very, very important thing to stimulate both clonal regrowth and as well as aspen seeds, which are very dependent on bare mineral soil, which in the West is usually created through fire. So if you don't have fire, you also have much less aspen and much less habitats that are conducive to those pioneer species. So as an overview, I hope I showed some reasons why aspen is a somewhat interesting, unique species that we might care about. Talked about some of the reasons why it's widespread across North America, and then touched on a few reasons why it's declining. However, with increasing fire, as we know, like in this part of the world, probably having more fire going forward, that might kind of counteract some of the other forces that are leading to aspen decline and make aspen a more important species going forward, because it can regenerate well after fire and it can disperse a lot further than conifer trees. So with that, I want to thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions or to talk in conversation afterwards. So thank you very much. Yes.
Mark, over Cleveland, Colorado, I've got land down there, the beetles have all the lodge full out rapidly. My question is, with thinning in that,
Well, they'll self-thin. I mean, with just through time. You mean thinning of the aspen themselves?
right, they're
Yeah.
all 4 or 5 feet tall.
Yeah. I guess it would depend on your goals or your like what you want out of that. I think that even like a young thicket of aspen can be like great habitat for lots of wildlife. And I think through time, it'll self-thin through competition. So I would say it's probably less important than if your goal was to be growing harvestable lumber or something. But you're probably not doing that with aspen. Yes.
What do you mean by bark?
So yeah, so the bark itself, there's the cells of the bark I guess underneath the bark have chlorophyll, and so they're taking in light and creating sugars, just like the leaves are.
Are they green?
Mm-hmm. This might be going way far back. There's slight some. Okay, here we go. Some, especially young aspen trees, like on the left, have a slight like greenish tinge to them. But even the more white aspen, there are still chlorophyll in the cells. And my understanding is that most plant cells have chlorophyll, even in twigs and bark and stems. So I think anywhere that the light can reach, there's probably generally those reactions occurring. Although of course the leaves are more tailored and suited to that.
The light is penetrating the one part into the underlying.
Yeah, and so this paper showed that the bark photosynthesis was about 11 to 25%, like the rate of leaf photosynthesis. So a lot less, but still significant.
I just thought about birch. And the birch, would that be the same as
Yeah, I think birch also does that. So I think it's generally restricted to thin barked trees, because of course, like a ponderosa pine or a Douglas fir with a thick bark that's supposed to like insulative and fire protective, probably light isn't making its way through.
So what is that? So ponderosa pine isn't doing photosynthesizing in the winter.
Well, I mean, the needles are still on.
Well, the needle,
yeah.
okay, so another deciduous tree.
My
isn't-
understanding, yeah. Sorry, go on.
you know, that it isn't photosynthesizing. in the winter. Yeah,
A maple, yeah. My understanding is that, I mean, yeah, without leaves and with thicker bark, there'd be much less. I imagine potentially, and this is going outside of I've read the stuff about aspen, not about other species. I imagine maybe on twigs and things that were a little thinner barked, it's possible.
This is like, you can't really answer this, but why, so is it doing that in the winter?
Mhm.
And why?
So
mean, what is that?
This is a graph across months. I guess maybe I didn't make like it's hard to read that x-axis. So in June right here, like during the summer, the bark is making much more, or taking in much more carbon dioxide. And then during the winter, it's very low in November, December, February. But like March, April, May, like the aspen trees don't have leaves still in April or March, and yet it's already ramping up. So I think it is related to temperature, because I think the reactions do slow down just by virtue of it being cold. But there is this portion in here where there's no leaves, but it is adding carbon or pulling carbon in.
In the upper Gunnison River Valley, Colorado, you'd see a stand, across the hillside, and there'd be one area in the fall, one slight color. Some people said they were homes, other people were saying.
I think both are true in different cases. I think in general, you can tell clones by fall color, but there can be parts of a clone that change at different times or turn different colors. And I think that's because that's also controlled by more microclimate, soil, moisture and temperature and nutrients and things. Which is why like the most foolproof method of clone detection is the spring leaf out. I think I think it must be more controlled by some hormonal process.
We were talking about these clones, like we did in the mother tree, right? And kind of divided that because 20 years max, something done. Are the roots the same rate of decay, or will they last longer?
That's also a question that I don't know, but that's a good. Yeah, I mean, and it gets to the question of if the roots at some point have all been recycled. I mean, it's true to also of our bodies. Like at some point, if the cells are completely new, is it still the same?
Yeah.
But the genetic code is the same, and like is maintained throughout. Even if I'm not sure like the kind of turnover rate of roots. Yeah, those things like beneath the ground are always. We always know less about them because they're a lot harder to observe. Yeah.
What did you say? More
No. It's in post-fire sort of climate and regeneration pattern. So looking at how forests respond after fire and how climate plays an important role in that. But I'm doing the work in the sub-Middle wilderness and conifer dominated systems. So fire is a shared sort of topic, but and forests, but different species. Yeah. Yeah, happy to stay and talk to anyone.
Thank you.
Mentioned that I believe Mark has taken a lot of these photos that he shared, and I think you had an exhibit
Yes,
on campus, so
You do or you did?
I did.
Oh,
yeah.
That's where I connected with you.
That's where I captured it.
oh,
So anyway,
that's
lots of great photography. So appreciate it.
yeah.
That's great.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's one of the best talks I've seen in a while, and I see there's one comment.
Oh yeah, I wasn't.
Thanks everyone at home. Okay, I'm gonna unmove it.
Oh, now you know.